It started with a glance that lasted a second too long. The kind of look that isn't curious, but suspicious. The kind that quietly decides something is wrong before a word is spoken. She was standing there like she had done 100 times before, relaxed posture, shoulders back, nothing exaggerated. The uniform fit her the way it fits someone who has worn it under stress, not for attention. To her, this was routine. To the person watching her, it was a problem waiting to be solved. Someone finally spoke up, not with a question, but with certainty. They said she couldn't be a Navy SEAL. The words came out casual at first, almost joking, but there was an edge underneath. She didn't look like what they imagined. Too calm, too ordinary, too female. And in their mind, that was enough. She responded the same way anyone who knows they're telling the truth would respond. Simple answers. No defensiveness. No performance. That only made things worse. The accusation escalated quickly. What began as doubt turned into an outright claim that she was impersonating military personnel. Stolen valor is a heavy charge, especially in a place where people pride themselves on spotting fakes. Phones came out. Voices got louder. Someone insisted they knew a real SEAL, and she didn't match the picture in their head. Another person chimed in, pointing out some tiny detail they thought was wrong. A patch, a stance, a tone of voice. None of them were correct, but confidence has a way of sounding like authority. She tried to shut it down by showing identification. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it became fuel. They examined it like amateur detectives, convinced they would find a flaw. When they didn't, they assumed it had to be fake. The logic was backwards, but no one noticed. In their minds, the conclusion was already locked in. She was lying. Everything else was just supporting evidence. Someone called the police. Not out of fear, but out of righteousness. The kind that feels heroic in the moment. The report was delivered with certainty. A woman claiming to be a Navy SEAL. Clearly impersonating. Possibly dangerous. By the time officers arrived, the story had already grown. Details were added. Tone shifted. What was once a suspicion had turned into a narrative. When law enforcement showed up, the dynamic changed. The crowd relaxed. Now there were uniforms with badges. Now there was power backing the accusation. She explained herself again, calmly, the same way she had before. She handed over credentials. She answered questions. But now the pressure was heavier. The officers didn't arrive neutral. They arrived already leaning toward one side. Impersonation cases are common. Female Navy SEALs are rare. One of those facts felt more real to them than the other. Questions became sharper. Doubt turned into procedure. Procedure turned into action. At some point, a decision was made that didn't feel dramatic in the moment, but would later carry serious weight. They chose to believe the accusation instead of the evidence. They decided it would be easier to sort it out later. They told her she was being detained. The cuffs came out not because she resisted, not because she acted suspicious, but because someone else had been so sure she didn't belong. People watched as if their instincts had been proven right. There was a quiet satisfaction in the air. The kind that comes from thinking you've caught someone in a lie. No one considered the alternative. No one paused to ask how often confidence is mistaken for truth. As she was led away, there was no scene. No shouting. No dramatic protest. Just a controlled walk. Eyes forward, jaw set. The posture of someone who knows exactly who they are, even when everyone else has decided there's something else. The accusation that started with a look had now turned into an arrest record, paperwork, radio calls, and assumptions logged into official systems. What made it worse wasn't just the accusation itself, but how quickly it was accepted, how easily disbelief hardened into action, how no one stopped to think about why she didn't sound nervous, why she didn't stumble, why she didn't over-explain. The moment someone decided she couldn't be real, everything she did became suspicious by default. And all of it began with one simple, confident statement from someone who thought they knew what a Navy SEAL was supposed to look like. The disbelief didn't come from evidence. It came from expectation. People carry mental images of what certain roles are supposed to look like, and anything outside that image feels wrong, even when it's true. In their minds, a Navy SEAL was tall, loud, aggressive, and unquestionably male. It was a caricature built for movies, stories, and secondhand bragging. When she stood in front of them, None of that matched, so they decided the role itself couldn't possibly fit her. Her confidence worked against her. She didn't overcompensate or try to prove anything. She spoke plainly, answered directly, and didn't raise her voice. To someone telling the truth, that feels normal. To someone hunting for a lie, it looks rehearsed. They expected nerves. They expected cracks. When they didn't get them, they assumed she must have practiced the story. Calmness was mistaken for deception. There was also discomfort underneath the disbelief. A quiet kind that doesn't always announce itself, but still drives decisions. Some people simply weren't ready to accept that a woman could hold a position they had placed on a pedestal for years. Admitting she was real meant revising their understanding of strength, capability, and who gets to belong in elite spaces. That kind of adjustment takes effort, and disbelief is easier. Every small detail became a test she didn't know she was taking. The way she stood, the way she spoke, the fact that she didn't name-drop units or missions. They wanted bravado. They wanted stories. They wanted something dramatic enough to satisfy their idea of authenticity. When she didn't give them that, it confirmed their bias. In reality, the people who've lived extraordinary experiences rarely feel the need to perform them on demand. Someone claimed they had known real Navy SEALs before. That statement carried weight, even though it was vague and unprovable. It didn't matter that experience can vary wildly, or that elite training doesn't erase individuality. Familiarity was treated as expertise. Their personal reference point became the measuring stick, and she didn't line up with it. The idea of rarity played a role too. Because female Navy SEALs are uncommon, people treated that fact as evidence against her instead of simply a statistic. Rare became impossible. Unusual became fake. Instead of asking how she got there, they asked how she was getting away with it. Probability was used as a shortcut to judgment. Even her credentials weren't enough. Identification only works if the person looking at it is open to being convinced. They searched for errors instead of confirmation. They assumed it had to be forged, because accepting it as real would force them to admit they were wrong. At that point, the goal wasn't truth. It was validation of their original suspicion. Authority reinforced the disbelief. Once others joined in, the doubt felt shared and therefore correct. Group consensus replaced individual reasoning. No one wanted to be the person who defended the supposed imposter. That kind of support carries risk. Accusation feels safer when it's collective. Silence becomes agreement. There was also the subtle belief that real heroes announced themselves differently. Louder, stronger, more visible. She didn't match the performance people expected, so they assumed there was no substance underneath. They confused humility with fraud. They mistook professionalism for an act. What none of them recognized was that she had spent years learning when not to speak, when not to stand out, when not to explain herself to people who weren't entitled to answers. That instinct, trained and reinforced over time, now worked against her in a space that rewarded spectacle over substance. The disbelief grew stronger with every attempt she made to correct it. Each explanation was seen as a cover story. Each calm response was labeled calculated. The assumption hardened until it no longer needed reinforcement. They weren't listening to her anymore. They were listening to the version of her they had already decided existed. And so the gap widened between who she was and who they believed she could be, a gap filled not with facts, but with expectation, discomfort, and the refusal to imagine that reality might be broader than the stories they'd been told. The arrest didn't happen all at once. It unfolded through a series of small decisions, each one framed as reasonable in the moment. The officers didn't rush. They followed steps. They asked questions they had already decided the answers to. Their tone stayed professional, but there was an undercurrent of impatience, as if they were waiting for her story to slip. When it didn't, they moved forward anyway. She was told to wait while they verified information. Time stretched. Radios crackled. Names were repeated, spelled out, checked again. Each delay made the accusation feel more legitimate. People assume that if something takes long enough, there must be a reason. No one considered that bureaucracy often moves slower than truth. She stood there, hands visible, posture steady, knowing that anything she did to express frustration could be used against her. When the decision came, It was presented as temporary, just a formality, just until things were cleared up. That language softened the impact for everyone except her. Temporary still meant handcuffs. It still meant being treated as a suspect. It still meant a public declaration that the officers believed the accusation carried more weight than her word and her credentials. The cuffs were cold and tight, placed with practiced efficiency. No hesitation. No apology. The physical restraint changed how everyone looked at her. Moments earlier, she had been the one under suspicion. Now she was the one under control. For the onlookers, that confirmed everything. People trust visuals more than explanations. A person in cuffs looks guilty, regardless of context. She was guided toward the patrol car while questions followed her from behind. Some curious, some satisfied, some quiet. Phones stayed raised. No one stepped in. No one said this felt wrong. The officers weren't cruel, but they weren't curious either. Curiosity would have required them to pause, to reconsider, to acknowledge the possibility of error. Inside the car, the world narrowed. The door closed. Sound dulled. Movement became limited. The authority of the situation pressed in, not just physically, but psychologically. Being arrested isn't only about losing freedom. It's about being redefined in an instant. Your identity is replaced by a label that follows you through every step that comes next. At the station, the process continued. Paperwork, fingerprints, questions repeated in slightly different ways. Each repetition was another opportunity for them to catch her contradicting herself. She didn't. Her answers stayed consistent. Calm, clear. That consistency, which should have helped her, was now treated as further proof of rehearsal. She was asked why she would pretend to be something like that. The question itself revealed how little they were listening. It assumed guilt. It assumed motive. It forced her to respond within a framework that didn't allow for the truth she was trying to explain. Every response had to push against the weight of their assumptions. The consequences began stacking quietly. An arrest record initiated. Time logged. Reports written from a perspective that framed her as the problem. Those documents would exist long after the moment passed. Even if the truth came out, the initial narrative would still be there, shaping how others interpreted what happened. What made the situation heavier was how preventable it was. One phone call to the right office. One officer willing to question the premise instead of the person. One pause to consider that rarity doesn't equal impossibility. Instead, the system moved forward because that's what systems do when no one stops them. She understood that pushing back too hard could escalate things. Compliance was safer. Silence, measured answers, controlled breathing. Skills learned in environments far more intense than a police station now applied here in a different way. The irony wasn't lost on her. Training designed to handle chaos was now being used to endure misunderstanding. Time passed differently in custody. Minutes felt longer. The absence of control made every sound sharper. Doors opening. Footsteps. Voices that didn't address her. Each moment reinforced the reality that she was no longer being treated as who she was, but as what others believed she was. The arrest had consequences beyond the room she was sitting in. Calls that wouldn't be made. Responsibilities delayed. Questions raised by people who hadn't even heard her side yet. All of it stemming from a decision made by people who were sure they were doing the right thing. And through it all, the most damaging part wasn't the handcuffs or the paperwork, but the certainty with which the system moved forward once it decided she didn't belong, once it chose convenience over verification, once it treated disbelief as justification for action and allowed that assumption to carry her deeper into a process that was never designed to question itself. Once it began moving forward at all, the shift didn't happen with an apology or a sudden realization. It started quietly, almost reluctantly, when one small detail didn't line up the way it was supposed to. A name matched a record too cleanly. A number came back active instead of flagged. Someone reread a line they had skimmed over earlier and felt the first flicker of doubt. Not about her story, but about their certainty. Verification that had been treated as a formality suddenly mattered. Calls were made again, this time with different questions. The tone changed. Less accusatory. More precise. The kind of careful that shows up when people realize they might be standing on unstable ground. The officers who had been so sure before now spoke slower, choosing words more deliberately. A confirmation came back that couldn't be brushed aside. Not vague, not interpretive, direct. Her credentials were real, active, verified through channels that didn't leave room for opinion. The story they had been building began to collapse under the weight of a single fact they could no longer ignore. The room felt different after that. No one said anything right away. There was no dramatic pause, but there was a subtle tension, the kind that appears when authority realizes it has made a mistake and doesn't yet know how to handle it. She was still sitting where they left her, posture unchanged, expression controlled, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive on its own. More information followed. Training records, assignments, details that went far beyond what any impersonator would know, let alone fabricate convincingly. Each new piece didn't just confirm her identity. It exposed how shallow the original judgment had been. What they thought were inconsistencies were now clearly gaps in their own understanding. The questions stopped being about what she claimed and started being about how this had happened. Not out loud, but in the glances exchanged between officers, in the way paperwork was reread, in the pause before the next step. The confidence that had driven the arrest drained out of the room, replaced by something closer to discomfort. Someone finally acknowledged it, not with a formal statement, but with a quiet admission that things weren't adding up the way they expected. The words were careful, framed to minimize fault, focused on process rather than assumption. She listened without reacting, because reacting wasn't necessary anymore. The truth had weight now. It shifted the power dynamic instantly. The same uniform that had once raised suspicion now carried authority. The same calm demeanor that had been used against her now looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like all along. The narrative flipped, not because anyone wanted it to, but because it had to. What followed wasn't immediate correction, but recalibration. Reports needed revision. Calls needed clarification. Someone higher up needed to be looped in. The machine that had moved so efficiently in the wrong direction now struggled to reverse itself without drawing attention to the mistake. There was an unspoken awareness that this wasn't just an error. It was a failure of imagination, a failure to believe that someone like her could exist in the role she occupied. That realization hung in the air, uncomfortable and unresolved. She was uncuffed without ceremony. No speech, no explanation, just the removal of restraint and a subtle shift in how people stood around her. More distance, more respect, less eye contact. The change was quiet, but unmistakable. One officer avoided her gaze entirely. Another tried to sound neutral while asking if she needed anything. The question landed awkwardly, stripped of meaning by what had already happened. Needs didn't factor into the process that had put her there, and they didn't suddenly reappear now that the truth was undeniable. The irony settled in as details continued to surface. The very systems designed to verify legitimacy had been bypassed in favor of assumption, only to be relied upon once those assumptions fell apart. Everything that could have prevented the arrest had existed from the beginning. She was now the most qualified person in the room, not just by rank or training, but by composure. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't demanded special treatment. She hadn't tried to assert authority she didn't need to assert. She had simply waited for facts to catch up to reality. As the weight of confirmation fully set in, the focus shifted again, this time toward containment, toward minimizing fallout, toward figuring out how to move forward without acknowledging how quickly certainty had replaced judgment and how close confidence had come to overriding the truth entirely once the truth was established. The question of responsibility hovered without being directly addressed. No one rushed to claim ownership of the mistake. The system doesn't work that way. Accountability diffuses easily when many hands touch the same decision. Each person involved could point to a step, a protocol, a moment where they had relied on someone else's judgment. The accusation didn't belong to one individual anymore. It had become a collective action with no clear author. The original accuser faded into the background. Their certainty had set everything in motion, but now it was barely acknowledged. They weren't questioned the way she had been. No one asked why they were so confident or what evidence they had relied on. Their role was quietly minimized, treated as a misunderstanding rather than a catalyst. It was easier to move forward that way. Law enforcement focused inward, on procedures, on communication gaps, on how the situation escalated rather than why it started. The framing mattered. Escalation sounds mechanical. Bias sounds personal. One is easier to document and move past than the other. Reports would reflect process failures, not assumptions. Language would soften the edges of what had really gone wrong. No one said the word disbelief out loud. No one named the assumptions tied to her gender, her demeanor, her refusal to perform someone else's idea of authority. Those elements were invisible in official language, even though they were central to the outcome. What can't be quantified rarely makes it into records. There was also the unspoken protection of institutions. Acknowledging fault, too, clearly opens doors no one wants opened. Complaints, reviews, consequences that stretch beyond a single incident. It's safer to treat the situation as an anomaly, an unfortunate sequence of events, rather than a reflection of deeper patterns. She wasn't asked if she wanted to file a complaint. Not directly. The option was implied, hovering somewhere between formality and avoidance. Asking outright would mean acknowledging harm. Letting silence stand required less effort. The burden shifted to her, as it often does, to decide whether pushing for accountability was worth the additional cost. The officers involved adjusted their behavior, but not their posture. They became more careful, more restrained, but not openly remorseful. Apologies, when they came, were partial, conditional, framed around inconvenience rather than impact. Being detained, being delayed, not being disbelieved, not being arrested based on someone else's imagination. The power imbalance remained, even after the truth surfaced. She was free to leave, but the space still belonged to them. They controlled the environment, the documentation, the narrative that would live on in official channels. She carried the experience. They carried the authority to define it. What stood out was how quickly the system closed ranks. Not aggressively, but instinctively. Protecting itself by smoothing over rough edges, by avoiding language that might suggest misconduct. The machinery had made a mistake, but it wasn't built to dwell on that. It was built to keep moving. Responsibility blurred further when higher-ranking individuals became involved. Decisions were reframed as misunderstandings. Emphasis shifted to cooperation. Everyone had acted in good faith. No one intended harm. Intent replaced outcome as the primary measure of fault. The fact that harm still occurred became secondary. She listened to these explanations without interruption, not because she agreed, but because she understood the pattern. Institutions defend themselves by default. Individuals within them rarely step outside that reflex, even when presented with evidence that they should. There was a quiet expectation that she would be understanding, that her professionalism would extend to absolving others of discomfort, that she would accept the resolution as sufficient and move on. The irony of that expectation wasn't lost on her. The question of fault lingered without resolution. It sat in the space between what happened and how it would be remembered, between personal experience and official record, between accountability and convenience. And as the moment passed, as the urgency faded, it became clear that while the accusation had been proven wrong, the mechanisms that allowed it to happen remained intact, unexamined, and ready to repeat the same mistake the next time confidence outweighed curiosity and assumption stepped in where verification should have been allowed to speak first. The incident exposed how quickly authority becomes self-reinforcing once it aligns with assumption. From the outside, it looked like a series of reasonable actions taken by confident people. From the inside, it was a demonstration of how certainty can override curiosity and how systems reward decisiveness even when it's wrong. The moment someone decided she didn't belong, every structure around them moved to support that conclusion. Assumptions carry weight when they come from people who sound sure of themselves. Confidence is often mistaken for competence, especially in environments where questioning feels like weakness. The initial accusation didn't need proof because it arrived wrapped in certainty. Once accepted, it shaped how everyone else interpreted what they saw. Evidence wasn't evaluated on its own merit. It was filtered through a conclusion that had already been reached. Authority amplifies this effect. When a claim passes through uniforms, badges, or official language, it gains legitimacy regardless of accuracy. The presence of power discourages dissent. People defer, not because they agree, but because challenging authority requires effort, risk, and confidence of its own. In this case, disbelief became institutionalized simply because it was easier to follow than to question. The situation also revealed how narrow definitions of legitimacy can be. People rely on familiar patterns to decide what feels real. When something falls outside those patterns, discomfort fills the gap. Instead of expanding the definition, many choose to reject the outlier. It's a shortcut that saves mental energy but creates blind spots large enough to cause real harm. There's a particular danger in environments that value control and order. Procedures are designed to manage uncertainty, but they can also mask it. Once a process begins, it takes on a life of its own. Each step justifies the next. Pausing to reassess feels disruptive, even irresponsible. In that mindset, moving forward feels safer than stopping, even when forward is the wrong direction. The incident highlighted how easily professionalism can be misread. Calmness was interpreted as calculation. Precision was interpreted as deception. Restraint was interpreted as evasion. These interpretations weren't random. They reflected expectations about how truth is supposed to look. When reality didn't perform as expected, it was treated as suspect. There's also the issue of who gets the benefit of the doubt. Some identities are assumed credible by default. Others are required to prove themselves repeatedly. The burden of proof isn't evenly distributed. In this case, disbelief wasn't triggered by contradictory evidence, but by the absence of familiarity. That absence became justification for suspicion rather than a reason to learn. What happened shows how systems often respond to anomalies by trying to eliminate them instead of understanding them. Rather than asking how she fit into a broader reality, the system tried to force her out of it. That instinct protects the system's sense of coherence, but it does so at the expense of truth. The aftermath revealed another layer. Even when authority is proven wrong, it rarely interrogates the assumptions that led it there. Corrections are made quietly. Narratives are adjusted. Lessons remain vague. Without direct confrontation of the root cause, the same patterns remain intact, ready to reappear in a slightly different form. This wasn't about one mistake or one misunderstanding. It was about how quickly people accept a story that aligns with what they already believe, especially when that story is reinforced by power. It was about how easily the absence of imagination becomes a liability. It was about how authority, when left unquestioned, can turn confidence into a weapon against the truth. The incident serves as a reminder that systems don't fail loudly. They fail politely, efficiently, and with paperwork to justify every step. They fail while believing they are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. And the people caught in that failure are often the ones who least expect to be questioned, least expect to be doubted, and most expect that facts will be enough. What it ultimately reveals is that authority without curiosity is fragile, and confidence without humility is dangerous, and that the moment we stop asking whether we might be wrong is usually the moment we are most certain that we are right.